Welcome to the podcast. I'm your host, James Protin. Every week I will be sharing the experiences that have defined my journey and talking with people who have their own powerful story to tell. It's about doing better and being better in life, business, and all things in between. The visually inclined can catch us on YouTube, or you can check us out on just about every podcast platform. At Chrome Federal Credit Union, delivering more than the member expects is what we do. We believe in being there for the biggest and smallest moments. With Chrome, you aren't just a customer, you are a member. Join us today and experience the difference. Chrome, banking that shines. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the podcast. We are once again at our home away from home, the Cohatch location in the waterfront. And our guest this morning is a good friend of mine, Mr. George Robinson, the Director of Supplier Diversity at UPMC. Welcome to the show, my friend.
Thank you for having me, Jim.
We've been trying to get you here for a while.
Well, that's scheduling in 2024, and we're able to make today work on this Labor Day holiday weekend, and so really appreciate being here.
No, that's great. We're really excited to have you. I've been looking forward to this conversation. A lot of different ways we can go because we're both doing a lot of different things. Mm-hmm. But I wanted to ask you about talk about diversity in the Pittsburgh market, because that word diversity, inclusion, belonging, however you want to define that, looks different in just about every city in the country.
It does.
The way it's so. Can you talk me through where we're at in Pittsburgh, how far we've come, and where we need to go?
Sure. So I don't necessarily claim to be a specialist in this space. With me being the Director of Supplier Diversity and Inclusion, my main objective with UPMC is to ensure that we have business opportunities with diverse-owned companies, certified diverse-owned businesses. But that further dovetails into a much larger conversation of diversity, equity, and inclusion as a more general subject matter. And when we look at, where Pittsburgh is, I've been in Pittsburgh now 11 years. Originally from Toledo, Ohio. A lot of people aren't aware, Toledo, Ohio and the city of Pittsburgh basically have the same population head count, but I have seen diversity, equity, and inclusion executed from a totally different standpoint in Toledo than what I've seen in Pittsburgh. And I'll give two examples. From an elected perspective, from a municipal governance perspective, in Toledo in the early 80s, was sort of like this launch pad of African Americans and Hispanics being elected to city council, to the county council and things of that nature, where those individuals wanted to, number one, ensure that their communities had voice on the municipal scale. So everything from taxation to refuse to, policing policies and things of that nature. And there were some very outspoken individuals within the community that made certain, even if that guy that's sitting behind that city council desk isn't heard, we, the community, are going to be heard within, city office, the mayor's office and the political ranks. And so, growing up in that era where, I've actually seen sit-ins at the mayor's office where they've shut down, the mayor's operating seat to have their questions and issues and challenges heard and put before the mayor, to see some of those responses that have come out. It was very special. And then coming to Pittsburgh where, recognizing that, at one time, you had the Hill District prior to the Civic Arena being built. Right. And that entire ecosystem that dovetailed into how fragmented Pittsburgh is as a city with the borough system. Right. So we don't have that in Toledo. We had communities, but they were not literal lines like, thank you for leaving here, now welcome to this. But we don't have that in Toledo. So, when you have those sort of lines of demarcation, it further exacerbates the issue surrounding DEI because, in Pittsburgh, you have so many communities where people never cross a river. Right. Everything is sustained within this geographic ecosystem. Yes. And then it gets pushed down generation after generation. I
lived it. I grew up in it.
Yeah. And it's funny. I had a boss at the Water Authority. His name will go unmentioned. But when I moved from Cranberry into the city, and I was telling the neighborhood that I was looking at buying in, He said, man, that's West Virginia. Anything south of the Mon River is West Virginia. And I said, no, that's the city of Pittsburgh, because, the guideline here, I have to live in the city. And so, right. For him to have that comment, being a North Sider, now when you talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, especially in Pittsburgh, you have that layer of, what neighborhood did you grow up in? What high school did you go to? Right. And things of that nature that just further makes things more complex. Mm-hmm. Has Pittsburgh made strides? Definitely. But, that old adage of, is there so much more work that can be done? Most certainly there can be a lot more work done here in Pittsburgh. And Pittsburgh's a very unique city, even with that population size. Metro area is large enough to sustain much more creative DEI strategy execution.
Oh, absolutely.
But the one thing that I look at as, African-American male in my mid-40s is a lot of these decisions have been put before decision makers. Mm-hmm. They're just not choosing to make these certain decisions on, hiring, education, and things of that nature. And in some degrees, it looks sort of like they're masking it, trying to give, the common folk, some level of response, but it's an equitable response that's long-lasting and transformative. I'm still waiting to see that.
Well, yeah, I understand that, because, from my perspective, that gap is still there. It's as wide as it ever was, and I was thinking this, and I mentioned it to you earlier before we started filming, a few days ago we had the anniversary of Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech, on the Lincoln Memorial steps, right? So we're talking about 61 years ago.
Correct.
So this is basically, I'm 64, I was 3 years old at the time. So in the span of my lifetime, thinking about it from that perspective as to where we have come from there to now. And I haven't seen, again, from my perspective, that gap, closing that gap.
Sure.
And that's why I wanted to get your perspective, not to put you out there as an expert, but as somebody who's immersed in that.
Oh, sure.
Sure. And it's been a big part of my professional career, working at Chester Engineers, when we became minority owned. That was, I visibly and physically experienced being treated differently by clients. Sure. Once that acquisition took place.
Sure.
So when we went into a city or a utility such as Alcosan or those, not at Alcosan, but we were received differently.
Right.
And that's an attention getter, not necessarily in a positive way.
Well, and that's what I was going to say. I'm sure it just depended on where in the country 100%. You were, recognizing, there's certain geographies and demographics across the country that would welcome and encourage an organization like that to come in, because they see the vision that's physically and mentally capable when you have a skill set such as engineering coming in. Yep. It's funny you mentioned that. When I first got to Pittsburgh, working for a large, global engineering and architectural firm, looking at the, again, history of Pittsburgh, you got Carnegie Mellon, Pitt, Pittsburgh is an engineer's town. Oh, so many, products that have been developed and commercialized, not just talking the Heinz and the Westinghouses, but the stuff we don't even know about. So that has come out of Pittsburgh. This is that technical city that you would think, because of that horsepower and prowess, that more individuals of color and non-diverse individuals would be falling into these types of roles and opportunities, just because of how many things that have emerged out of Pittsburgh. But we're not seeing that.
You would think it would happen organically, but it doesn't. And I don't know if, that's not something that can be forced either.
Correct.
Right? Because that just makes it worse.
Correct.
That widens the gap, that creates resistance. But so how do we, particularly in the technical space, right? Because, we want to have more women, more people of color getting into the engineering space in those technical fields. But how do we guide that? How do we guide our young people to that if we don't have those examples to put up there?
So I will give that example, and this was a conversation that I had, piggybacking on where I left off, with 2 African-American CEOs of engineering firms here in Pittsburgh. And, I'm a very data-driven individual, so I looked at my own graduating class. I'm a chemical and environmental engineer from the University of Toledo, class of 2002. There were only 3 African-American males out of the entire engineering program that graduated with me. There were only 14 individuals of color, so African-American, Asian, Hispanic, that graduated out of that class of 240. And so, when I started having these talks with these 2 CEOs, because they were asking the same question 10 years ago, I said, let's look at the data. And so I actually pulled the graduation rates nationally of engineering students in the United States by demographic, racial demographic. And so for the total populace of engineers graduating for that particular year, I think it might have been 2012, there were only like 40,000 engineers graduating in the United States. Out of that 40,000, 0.02% were African American. Now, when we talk about engineering and its opportunities for economic development, infrastructure development, what I did is I said, okay, let's look at who our main competitors are. I pulled the data on India and I pulled the data on China, who a lot of people don't recognize had the caste system in place where literally light-skinned Indians are treated differently than dark-skinned Indians. And a lot of people don't realize in China that there are actually 50 ethnic groups that are considered minority
That
in
I did
China.
not know.
Correct.
That I did not know. That's interesting.
So just on total numbers, so the United States graduated like 40,000. So I'm going to ask you, how many engineers do you think India, the country, India, graduated at that same time?
I can't even imagine when you look at the disparity in people, just population in general. I had no idea.
So at that time, I think it was 400,000 Indians graduated with an engineering degree. Now, how many Chinese do you think graduated with an engineering degree?
I would think double that.
1 million.
Yeah, it's so, and that's reflected.
So 40,000, 400,000, 1 million. So we're looking at this industry, right? So even in looking at those numbers, I went back to why were there so many more? Even just comparing the population scales, India and China both are, roughly 3 to 4 times the size population as the United States.
Right.
But when India gained its independence from Britain, a lot of people don't realize prior to its independence, India was the industrial powerhouse for Great Britain as part of Commonwealth countries that, UK had taken over. They had taken so much of that industrial might out of India and planted it into the UK that what we saw upon India's independence was not that first world country that had manufacturing technology and things of that nature. We saw this quasi third world country where all those resources, both natural, talent, education, and industrial, had been tapped out of there, taken back to India, to the UK, applied there. Then they became the industrial powerhouse. But when India gained its independence, one of the things that its leadership at that time said is, we are going to make it a national endeavor that we will become the technological workhorse of the world. And so, we see that here live today.
Right.
How many Indian physicians do you know? How many Indian engineers do you know?
Right.
And in that STEM space, it is a national imperative within India. You have, students in India where if they come home and they tell their parents, I'm not interested in being a doctor or an engineer, they're like disowned because their culture, their national culture said, this is what is going to be important for us all the way into your household. You best have your child competing for, IIT and, these top universities across India where we are developing the people that are going to build everything in the world. They're going to design everything in the world. China basically did the exact same thing, but they put it to a whole nother level. because of the population. And so now we've seen sort of like this flip-flop. So then how do you take that conversation back to, domestic opportunities? Well, we're already getting killed globally.
Right.
But it's because of our culture and what we've been willing to accept, what we've been willing to put out into society. When we talk about, all boats rising in certain tides, well, it's unfortunate we're not taking the anchors off of certain communities and allowing them to rise in knowledge attainment, economic equality, and things of that nature, because our culture is tapped totally different.
Yep.
But that's where a lot of these changes need to come. We got to get out of the whole issue of, I'm going to be better than because of my color of my skin. No, you have individuals that, if only given the opportunity, not only would represent their communities well, but they would represent their state and their country in all endeavors. They would be the best of the best that just so happen to be an individual of color.
Access is everything.
Correct.
The seat at the table. And I think, you can't force your way in there. So these young people have to be granted that access.
Correct.
And that's on all of us. And, I'm a generation ahead of you.
Sure.
So you're the same age as my children.
Sure.
Right. So my son, for example, is doing very, very well for himself. He had access that he had even in the early 2000s, he had access that his friends, people of color in general, did not have. Mm-hmm. And, when thinking about that, I think my generation, and it's trickled down to yours, we have a responsibility. And we had a conversation early this morning with a gentleman from here that, there's desperation-driven progress, there's inspiration-driven progress.
Sure.
And I think my generation in particular falls in that desperation piece.
Sure.
Because we're at the end, and we have so much life experience to share.
Correct.
When you think about, George, my lifetime, and, I was aware enough in the 60s that I remember all of that. I remember vividly watching Neil Armstrong walk on the moon.
Sure.
I remember Dr. King and hearing him speak, vivid. I remember the riots in Detroit and all these things.
Yeah.
So, and as you move forward through the 70s and the 80s, I think we have a responsibility that we have shirked for a very long time.
Sure.
We haven't done that. And I think that we definitely have an opportunity to do that knowledge sharing and just to bring that wisdom. But it starts with conversations like you and I are having right now. Then it becomes an inspiration for you to take to your son and to the generations coming next. But I don't know that we do enough of that.
Well, and to your point, it's not necessarily having conversations with those that know. See, I've already taken that mantle up, realizing, both my parents, public school educated, not college degreed.
Right.
But they had cousins who were college degreed that made that, education decision. And you could see the fruits of that labor.
Right.
Both my sister and I have undergrads, have master's degrees. I'm ABD on a doctorate, done several exec ed programs, Georgetown, Carnegie Mellon, et cetera. But I knew from even just those small circles that I was involved in as a teenager, I was in certain programs where those children who had parents that were driving their children to say, hey, you're going to go far further than where I am today. So I'm going to put you in these environments, both educationally and socially, that, you are going to be that leader and we're going to help train you, even though I don't have the training. That was the whole thing. My parents didn't know better. They themselves didn't know better, but they knew people who knew better. And they put us in these environments. And so, my parents, they sacrificed putting my sister through private school and Catholic school, me through public school and Catholic school. But, now as a parent, I made sure from the skill that I was able to attain from those opportunities that I would try my best to make certain that my sons, and I have two boys, would have the best of that world and beyond. But there's, this saying that goes around about how the grandfather walked to work so the son could drive a Chevy to work. The son that drove the Chevy to work helped the grandson buy a Cadillac to work.
Right.
Cadillac, driving grandson has the great grandson that's driving the Ferrari, and then his son's walking to work.
Yeah, this the cycle. Yep.
So we're unfortunately getting into this cycle of that Cadillac to Ferrari, but we're not looking further out enough to say, wait a minute, because we've tried to make things so much easier because of the access that we as individuals have made, that we're not pushing our progeny further into walking.
Yeah.
Because we still have to, much like I was saying, when we talk about the race starting, realize that there's still this gap here, and making certain that gap attainment is a part of our children's upbringing, in the priority in terms of, all those decisions that they got to make. The world isn't getting any cheaper and it's not spinning any faster. And so we all have this sort of time continuum that we have to go through in making sure that we try to do our best, and that next generation recognizes they have that same responsibility too, or we'll all start to ease back. And, that's one of the things when you had asked me prior to starting, has Dr. King's dream been realized? Well, when I look at, I have my parents have cousins who are engineers, and what they went through in engineering school, and I know some of their classmates who were mentors of mine when I went through engineering school. They picked a tough road to toe, because it was very easy being in Toledo. We're part of that cradle of automotive out of Detroit. So we had plenty of factories where, a kid could drop out of high school at 15, walk down the street, and 30 seconds later be employed at Jeep or at Ford plant or Hydromatic. And make a good living. But all the while, behind the scenes, the price of living just continued to increase, where you could not just make that decision of, I'm not going to get that education and that real world experience to take both of those combined and push myself further in, employment and economic prowess. Today, it's almost, they talk about an MBA as like a bachelor's degree now, because everybody's got them. So then how do you differentiate yourself? And really, it goes back to, do you even know the fact that you have to differentiate yourself in order to remain competitive? Right. Well, how do you even learn those skills if you're in this environment where we're all fighting over DEI, instead of saying, how can we dismantle this and bring these communities that are underutilized into overutilization, so they get caught up to where everybody else is, then we all charge forward.
I agree. And the fact that we even have DEI speaks volumes about not only who we were, but who we still are.
Right.
And we talked about India and China and the STEM initiatives and things like that. Do you think that we, the United States, America as a country, are serious enough about STEM, invest enough in STEM?
I think we missed the boat.
Okay.
And it goes to, I would say, your generation, where, the United States was in, very precarious times. You had coming off of the Korean War, going into the Vietnam War, just that transition period of where, U.S. manufacturing started to leave, China started opening up, wall in Germany gets torn down. All these opportunities where in those, I'll say pre-50s or pre-60s situation, we had to stand alone. We're coming off of World War II, where you had a ton of manufacturing, everybody's working, you're rationing stuff to make certain that this war initiative moves. And then, you have the rebound of all this industry that gets kickstarted. Everybody's working, but not everybody's going to school. Not everyone is getting the education and knowledge to go that next step up. Right. So we got, comfortable in the middle class sort of space. But if you look at the demographics, you weren't bringing everyone along for the ride. Right.
There were people getting left behind, and not only people of color.
Poor whites were getting left behind.
It was again, and it circles back to access, and who has the responsibility of providing that access?
Correct. Well, when I look at it, I went to public school up through junior high. So in Ohio, junior high starts at 7th grade.
Yeah, sure.
So I went to a pretty decent public school, very diverse public school. It's funny. I asked my sons, have they ever had an African American teacher in their entire education? And they can only think of one time where their assistant principal here in Pittsburgh public schools was an African American male. And I'm rattling off, I had 5 black female teachers. I had 1 black assistant principal in a school that was in a upper class white neighborhood. And that neighborhood vested the school. Everybody in that neighborhood sent their kids there. There was no talk of, we're going to this Catholic school, unless you were like super hyper Catholic, where you belong to the parish and you're getting a discount because you're sending 7 kids there.
Yeah.
Everybody sent their kids to Toledo Old Orchard. And so being in that ecosystem, and Old Orchard went to 6th grade, so I transitioned to JZU, which is a feeder school into Toledo St. Francis. I was in a very unique situation because not every public school in Toledo had those dynamics.
Right.
So to your point, when you look at the decisions that are being made, there needs to be a much more heavy emphasis on improving public education in the United States.
Yes.
Because
Absolutely.
that is the gateway, and not so much the program enhancements of how can we take care of a few people that qualify, that yes, to have these deserving opportunities. So I look at like Pittsburgh Promise, for example. Yes, you have all this corporate engagement, financial support to help those students matriculate from high school to college and be successful. But what about everybody else? Right. And it's a whole lot of everybody else that isn't being brought along.
That's a big number.
Right. It's a far larger number than the number of kids that drop out of Pittsburgh Promise that you see on the Post-Gazette. Is a whole lot of everybody else that just gets thrown to the wayside. We need, and it's not necessarily safety netting programming, but literally how do we build more transformative programming across the entire ecosystem to bring everyone's communities up to a level set where we can start to see these transitions.
100%. Listen, I really, I could sit here.
I know we could go on.
we definitely as we get into the fall, let's schedule a part 2 conversation, because we just touched on one small piece of who you are and who I am, and the things that we have in common. So, young man, I really appreciate this. This was a great conversation.
Thank you.
We will definitely do it again.
Indeed.
Thank you.